Hello science fans, and welcome to SHE-ensya. What exactly are viruses? Are viruses alive? Where did viruses come from? And why do they exist in the first place? Why do we ask questions? The SHE-ensya Why series will dissect some of our most head-scratching who, what, where, when, and why questions, teasing out the scientific principles from historical records, conspiracy theories, and mass media. Join us in today's episode where we ask the question, why viruses? The evolution of viruses represents a fascinating but confusing topic for both scientists and non-scientists. There is a huge diversity among these entities, and we have struggled to classify them and relate them to the classical tree of life. They may represent DNA or RNA-based molecules that gain the ability to move between cells. They may represent previously free-living organisms that became parasites. They may even be the precursors of life as we know it. So, let's hear what science has to say and talk about what viruses are. Viruses are microscopic parasites, generally much smaller than bacteria. And when a virus is completely assembled and capable of infection, it is called a virion. The structure of a simple virion is made up of an inner nucleic acid core surrounded by an outer casing of proteins known as the capsid. Capsid proteins protect viral nucleic acids from being chewed up and destroyed by special enzymes in our cells called nucleases. Now, some viruses also have a second protective layer known as the envelope. Interestingly, the envelope is often made up of materials taken from the cell membrane of the host, little bits that are stolen, repurposed in order to serve the virus itself. What? The DNA or RNA found in the core of the virus can be single-stranded or double-stranded. But either way, it represents the genome or the sum total of the genetic information of the virus. Now, viral genomes are generally small in size. Their DNA and RNA only code for essential proteins. This includes the capsid and other necessary proteins needed to hijack a host cell. What a virus does is it delivers its genome into a host cell, and once this is expressed, more copies of the virus can be made. But in order to do this, the virus must first gain access to the inside of the host's body. Respiratory passages and open wounds can act as gateways for viruses. Even insects can provide a mode of entry. Some viruses can hitch a ride on an insect's saliva and get transferred once we get bitten by an insect. Ew. Oh! And once viruses are inside our bodies, they will then attach themselves to host cell surfaces. They do so by recognizing and interlocking with unique proteins protruding from our cells. These are called cell surface receptors, and they behave like puzzles that lock together. Many different viruses can bind to the same receptor, and a single virus can bind different cell surface receptors. And the ability of viruses to do this is both impressive and frustrating, because cell surface receptors are initially created to serve us, not the virus. But anyway, after a virus binds to the surface of the host cell, it can start to move across the outer covering or membrane. And once the virus gets inside the cell, it releases its genome and hijacks the cellular machinery of our cells. Viral genomes direct host cells to ultimately produce viral proteins, while mostly stopping the synthesis of any RNA and proteins that the host cell can use. And viruses even stack the deck in their favor by creating conditions within the host cell and within the host organism that will allow it to spread itself faster and wider.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
For example, when suffering from the common cold, one sneeze emits 20,000 droplets containing rhinovirus or coronavirus particles. The viral infection is what caused us to sneeze in the first place, and inhaling or touching any of these droplets is all it takes for the cold to spread. But given the impact of viruses in our lives, are they even alive? To consider this question, we need to have a good understanding of what we mean by life. Although specific definitions may vary, we generally agree that all living things share key properties. They can grow, reproduce, maintain an internal homeostasis, respond to stimuli, and carry out various metabolic processes. In addition, population of living organisms can evolve over time. You want to learn more about evolution? Then watch the video that will pop up over here at the end of this one. Now, do viruses conform to these criteria? Well, yes and no. We've seen that viruses reproduce in some way. Just like when we get infected by a virus and we get sick, that's basically a symptom of the virus hijacking our mechanisms so that it can replicate itself. So that's kind of reproduction in its own unique way. Also, we've seen that viruses evolve over time. That's the reason why before we needed to get a flu vaccine every year because the virus that causes it evolves. And now, it is also the reason why we're seeing new strains of the COVID-19 virus. However, viruses do not carry out metabolic processes. And most notably, viruses differ from us living organisms because they cannot generate metabolic energy that keeps our cells alive and functioning. And this is the molecule known as ATP. Viruses also do not have the necessary machinery for translation or the creation of proteins. And because of these limitations, a virus can only replicate and evolve within a host cell. Therefore, viruses are called obligate intracellular parasites, which means that they only behave like a living thing when they're inside a host and they do damage in the process. So, according to a stringent definition of life, they are non-living. But not everyone agrees with this conclusion. They can, after all, represent a whole new different organism in the tree of life, such as capsid encoding organisms, or CEOs.
Damn!
Given their strange nature, where could have viruses come from? There is actually much debate among virologists about this question, but three main hypotheses have been formulated. According to the progressive hypothesis, viruses originated through mobile genetic elements. And these would be small pieces of DNA or RNA that are capable of jumping around the genome and eventually gain the ability to exit the cell. This capability of DNA or RNA projected in the progressive hypothesis closely mirrors the movement of an unusual component of our genomes, called the retrotransposons. These mobile genetic elements make up an astonishing 42% of our genome, and they jump around using an RNA intermediate. We don't exactly know what they're for, but they certainly help maintain genetic diversity. The regressive hypothesis, on the other hand, suggests that existing viruses may have evolved from free living organisms that lost genetic information over time as they adopted a parasitic approach to replication. After all, some microbiologists agree that certain bacteria that are obligate intracellular parasites like chlamydia or rickettsia actually evolved from free living ancestors. Viruses of one particular group, called the nucleocytoplasmic large DNA viruses, or NCLDVs, best illustrate this hypothesis. The NCLDVs possess large genomes, with some reaching as much as 1.2 million base pairs. They also exhibit less dependence on the host cell when it comes to their ability to replicate, and their existence could indicate that they may have evolved from a previously free living ancestor. Now, both the progressive and regressive hypotheses both assume that cells existed before viruses. But what if viruses existed first? The virus first hypothesis is grounded on how we generally agree that the first self-replicating molecules are RNA. And it is possible that a pre-cellular RNA learned how to infect cells, and that our current single-stranded RNA viruses could be descendants of these strange parasitic RNA molecules. Where viruses come from is not a simple question to answer. It is even possible that today's viruses arose multiple times through multiple mechanisms. So it's possible that no single hypothesis can explain or answer this basic question. And so, science has spoken. Viruses are entities made up of a protein shell that encases genetic information in the form of DNA or RNA. They behave like living things when inside a host cell by hijacking the cellular machinery of the host so that they can replicate and evolve. But outside the host, they behave like non-living things that are incapable of metabolism. We don't know yet where viruses come from, and there are multiple hypotheses trying to explain it, which includes one that indicates the possibility of them coming from mobile genetic elements called retrotransposons, and another that tries to explain their existence as a regressive evolution from previously free-living organisms. And finally, there is also a hypothesis that indicates they could have existed before cells through self-replicating RNA molecules. But then again, why do viruses exist? Well, there is a hypothesis that states that life on planet Earth arose because of the need of a molecule to be replicated, be protected from the elements, and be passed on to the future by transferring from one cell to the next. So viruses can be an expression of the selfishness of our genes and their quest for immortality. So it is quite humbling actually to think, if this is true, that we are, at the end of it, just vessels or containers for our DNA. And that's it for today's episode of SHE-ensya. I hope you were able to learn something from our short video today. And if you did, I hope you can give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to our channel. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please don't hesitate to message me, your resident Filipina scientist, in the comment section below. Thank you very much, and see you around!